So I'm going to show you how to add a fragment to a regular normal activity. So I've created a main activity that's just the generic Hello World activity that we've seen before. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to add a fragment to it, and then I'm going to convert that fragment to a list fragment. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to go File. Whoops, before I do that, I want to make sure that I have highlighted the folder with my main activity because I want my fragment code to be added to the same folder as the main activity code. So if I go File, New, Fragment, and I'm going to just create a blank fragment. I'm not going to create a layout file for the fragment because eventually I'm going to convert this to a list, and a list comes with its own fragment, its own layout. I'm not going to include the fragment factory methods because I'm not going to need most of them, but I am going to include the interface callbacks, and I'll explain what that is when I get to them. I'm going to hit Finish. So now I have a brand new blank fragment. It is extending support version 4.app, and that's a backward compatible fragment. So I'm just going to convert that to just a regular normal fragment. Just import a normal fragment. It's got some layouts and some views that are imported with this. So this public class blank fragment is in the same package as my main activity. It's importing a whole bunch of things that we'll eventually use. Then blank fragment extends fragment. It's got an empty constructor because every fragment needs to have an empty constructor, which will be called when the app adds the fragment to the activity. The activity adds it to himself. It's got an onCreate view. Right now, it's got a text view that it's going to create and add some text to it. We're going to eventually get rid of that and add a list. It's got a button pressed method, assuming that you would have a button on this fragment. We're not. We're going to eventually have a list item pressed. It has an onAttach method. The onAttach method is used when the fragment is attached to the activity, and it's going to check to make sure that you have defined a method to handle fragment interaction in the activity that you add this to, and otherwise it's going to throw an error. You're not going to need to change this method. It's going to be work just fine as it is. It's got an onDetach method, which just is what happens if you take the fragment off of the activity. And it's defined an interface which handles, describes how data is passed between the fragment and the activity the fragment's attached to. So now I'm going to go through and I'm going to edit this to make this a list fragment. So at the top, we're going to keep the context at the top. I'm not going to use the URI, but we'll eventually get rid of that. Instead of extending fragment, I'm going to extend list fragment. And then down here, I'm going to have to go list fragment. Every place I had fragment, make this a list fragment. And no other red underlines, so now we're good. Going to keep the view. I really won't need layout interface. Well, that'll eventually disappear. I'm not going to need a view group. I'm not going to take the text view, but I am going to add a list view, which I'm not using right now. I'm also going to need to import Android .widget. Most of the things you can add to an app are considered to be widgets. Oops, not list view. already have ListView, array adapter. I'm going to add an array adapter because the array is going to contain the data that appears in my list. So the rest of this continues. BlankFragment extends ListFragment. I have an onFragment interaction listener, which is my method. I need that. I'm going to create another private variable for the moment, which is going to contain the data in the list that's going to appear on my list. So I'm going to do private string. I'm going to create a string array. It's just a regular Java array. I'm going to call it items equals, and then to create a simple array, I use 2 curly braces, and I'll just have as many items as I want. Item 1 to item 2, item 3. So I've got 3 items that are appearing in my array. Now I'm going to have my default constructor. It's a mandatory empty constructor. It's public, and we'll just leave it there. We'll use that later. I'm going to need something else when I create a new instance, which would allow it to take arguments and know which version of the fragment you were going to include. So it would be public static. It's a static method because you would call this regardless of out of the context of the eventual fragment you're creating. We'll just so it's independent of the individual fragment. So it's going to return a blank. What did I call it? Is it blank? Yes, blank. It's going to return a blank fragment. This is going to be used to set up our fragment. Outside of, it's like a constructor, but since the activity calls only an empty constructor, you have to do this separately. I'm going to pass in, I'm going to say new instance. That's the name of the method. And I'm going to pass in string. Right now it is going to pass in 1 string parameter. Eventually we might change those parameters, but for the time being, this method is going to pass in 1 parameter. And so to create, it's going to create a new blank fragment. BF, so blank fragment, or maybe I'll call it fragment. Frag equals new blank fragment. And it would help if I could type blank, BLANK fragment. It's going to call the default constructor, which takes no values. And then it's going to create some bundled arguments that you could pass back and forth between fragments and activities. Bundle, B-U-N-D-L-E. We'll call it args, which just stands for arguments, equals new bundle. Right now we're not putting anything in it. Well, actually we are. So I'm going to set the arguments for the fragment. So it goes this is my frag, which is what I just created, equals dot set-arguments. We're going to set the arguments that the fragment uses to this bundle we just created. So if there's any data passed to the fragment will know what it is. Did I have a space there? No space. So I'm going to call the set argument method, and that's just a method that comes built in with the fragment class. And then I'm going to return the fragment. Okay, so that's going to create, and if it would help if I could spell fragment. There we go. So I've created a new blank fragment. I created a bundle, and I set the arguments for the fragment to whatever that bundle is. Right now there's nothing in the bundle, but later we might add something to the bundle. So this is just a generic method that sets up your new blank fragment. And we'll call it from our activity. Now my fragments, I'm going to use an onCreate method instead of the onCreateView method. So the onCreate method is a void method, so I'm going to get rid of my onCreateView. Going to keep the override because I'm going to override the onCreate method. So I'm going to go public void onCreate, and it's going to take a bundle. Well, actually, we usually call it saved instant state. Curly braces. So onCreate. So it says I should call this superride, and so that is definitely what I will do. So I'll go super, which will call the onCreate method in the super fragment class. Super onCreate, and we're going to pass in that bundle. So saved instance state. There we go. Now I'm going to check and see if there were any arguments in the bundle. So if I go if, or pass to the method. So if I go if get arguments, or to the fragment, not equal to null, then we're going to do something. Right now, I don't know what to do. We haven't passed any arguments in. We will use this later. Following the if statements, we're going to need to set up what the list will look like. Now, there's a couple of ways we could do this. We could create a layout file that defines what the list will look like. This layout file would define what any individual list item would look like. So it could have an image, it could have multiple lines of text. The simplest way to do this for a very simple list is to use a built-in layout file. And so we're going to use a built-in layout file that's going to be, it's called Simple List Item 1. And it comes built in with the Android Studio packages. And so we don't have to define our own layout file. That's why I didn't have you create a layout file for the fragment. So I'm going to do set list adapter. So this is a thing that's going to set the adapter for the list that we're using in this app. And I'm going to call it a new array adapter. New array adapter, which is just designed to adapt an array and put it in the list. And this array adapter uses a string array. So you have to specify here that it's a string array. And then you're going to have an open curly parentheses. So I'll put my opening and closing parentheses. In between the parentheses, we're going to pass in data, which is going to create, set up the adapter. So I'm going to get activity. Actually, I'm going to get context, which is the context that this fragment is running under. And then I'm going to go I'm going to go, I'm going to say get activity because that's not backward compatible. So activity, get activity. Then I'm going to go and I'm going to use this layout file that I was talking about. It's Android.r. It's a resource dot layout dot simple list item 1, comma, and I didn't spell Android right, A-N-D. There go, list item 1. It recognizes it, which is good. And I'm going to go Android, D-R-O-I-D dot R dot ID dot TEXT1. So this default, and I forgot the N, help if I could type. This layout file essentially defines one piece of text that you can change, and that one piece of text has got the ID of text1. And then I'm going to pass in my items array, ITEMS, which is the name of the array that's going to be used to populate that list item. So now I've created my list adapter, and I forgot a semicolon at the end of my line. And now I've got a list, and it's been populated with the items in my array. Later, we will populate it with different items. So now that I've got the onCreate method, we are going to delete the onButtonPressed method. OnButtonPressed, because we're not going to press a button. But maybe I'll just go ahead and change this. So I'm going to change this to on list item click, which is the method, and it would help if it would be lowercase click, which is the method that was called when you press on an item in a list. This method is automatically passed. It's not passed the URI. What it is passed is the list view. I'm going to call that L. It's passed in a view, which is I'm going to call V. It's passed in an int, and it's passed in a int position, which is really just the item in the list that's been clicked. And finally, it's passed in an ID, which is a long ID, I think related to the list. So once you've got this, we're going to call the super method for this to handle anything that the list view wants to handle before I do anything with it. So I'm going to go super dot on list item click, and I'm going to pass in the L, the V, the V, two V's, one V, the position, and the ID. So if the listener, and this is the thing that's listening for an item click, is not equal to null, then it's going to call the onFragment interaction method. And the old thing was going to pass in a URI. That's not really what we want to pass. We want to pass in, I think, a string. At minimum, you could pass in a string and Oops, string. Well, we'll start by passing in the int position. So at minimum, we want to know which item, POISITION, POI. Oh, we're going to just pass in the position. We don't have to declare what type it is. There we go. POSITION. It's giving me an error because down below, I've got it specified that it's passing in a URI. So I'll have to correct and make these two things agree. As I said, onAttach exists, so we don't have to do anything with it. On detach, we'll leave exactly as it is. And then I'm going to go down to my onFragment interaction, and it said it was taking a URI. I'm going to change it to taking an int. I'll just call it P. There we go. So now everything appears to have been corrected in my fragment. There's a few things up at the top that I wound up not using. So I'm not using the URI. I'm not using the layout inflator, and I'm not using the view group. Otherwise, this now should be a complete list fragment that could be then used in an activity. So I'm going now to my activity. I'm going to add the list fragment to my activity. So to add my list fragment to my activity, I need to do a couple of things. First, in my main activity, I'm not going to need this text view. Instead, I am going to use a frame layout, and I'm going to put the fragment into the frame. So I'm going to change this, and I'm not going to use a constrained layout. So here I'm going to go, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete activity main. So right here, I'm going to delete activity main. I'm going to go, okay, I'm going to delete it anyway. I'm going to create a new activity main. So I'm going to create a new activity main. So I'm going to go new layout resource file, and I'm going to make it a relative layout. Relative layout. I'm going to call it activity_main, like my old one. And I'm just going to go, okay. So now I've got a new activity main. Let's look at it. But instead of being a constrained layout, it's a relative layout. And in this relative layout, I am going to add a frame that I'm going to add my fragment to. So I'm going to add a frame layout. It's my base tag. I'm going to give it an Android ID, because everything needs to have an ID so you can access it from code. ID equals, and I'm going to give it an ID is @+ID / you can give the frame any name you want. I'll call it my frame. There we go. Now from that frame, I can give it width, so Android layout width, and height. I'm going to give it essentially the same. So Android layout. You can look them all up if you don't want to type Android layout. So width, Android layout width. I'm going to do match _parent. It's going to be as wide as my parent. I'll hit carriage return so we can see. Then I'm going to do Android layout height. Let's look for that here. There we go. Height equals match parent. It's going to be as big as my parent. And then I'm going to have the closing tag, and I have my ending frame layout. So now my app is essentially a blank screen. It's got a frame layout, and the frame has nothing in it. So I'm going to go into my main activity, and I'm going to add my fragment to my main activity. So here's my main activity with the basic import statements, it's pretty small. So I'm going to have to add a few things to add the fragment to my main activity. So I'm going to have to add import Android app fragment manager. This is a tool that allows me to add fragments to my app. I'm going to import, I'm going to copy that. So in addition to the fragment manager, I'm going to add a fragment transaction. Which allows me to do stuff with my fragment. And that's all I have to add. At the top of my code, I'm going to go ahead and in my, actually, I may use my fragment manager and my fragment transaction outside of my code. So I may make a global variable. Public fragment So I've created a fragment manager variable that it will hold my fragment manager. I'm going to create a fragment transaction variable. It's going to be called, why is this underlined? Variable fragment manager is already defined. Well, there we go. That's good. So I've created a fragment manager and a fragment transaction. So I go into my onCreate, which is my basic onCreate. I call my super. I'm going to set my layout. I can either set my layout before or after, but I'm going to go ahead and set it here. But before I do that, in order for, well, actually, I'll show you the error once we get to it. So I'm going to go, and I'm going to get a reference to my fragment manager. So fragment manager equals get fragment manager. That just gets the fragment manager for this app. And then I'm going to create a reference. I'm going to start my fragment transaction. So I'm going to go fragment, R-A-G-M-E-G-M-E-N-T, transactions equals, no dot, equals fragment manager dot begin transaction. There we go. That's the begin transaction method. Semicolon. So I'm beginning a transaction. Now what I want to do is I want to get a reference to my blank fragment. So I'm going to create a new blank fragment. So the way I would do it is I would do blank fragment BF new equals new blank fragment. So that's going to create a new instance of my blank fragment. And so now I'm going to want to add the blank fragment to my frame. So I'm going to use my fragment transaction. .add. I'm going to add to r.id dot, and I think I called it my frame. That's what I gave it, the ID I gave my frame. And to that frame, I'm going to add the blank fragment. And then I'm going to go fragment transaction, transaction dot commit. Call the commit method to commit the activity, to commit the transaction on fragment interaction listener. And I haven't defined anything to make a shortcut, so I could go, it's really the on fragment interaction listener in the blank fragment. There we go, on fragment interaction listener. So I've implemented that, but it can't resolve it because I haven't actually, let's make sure I've got this, oh, it's uppercase O, and I have a lowercase o. There we go. Now I'm going to get an error because I have not overwritten that particular method. So I'm going to go down here, and below this, I'm going to create the method that it's telling me I need to create. And that method is void on fragment interaction that's passed an int. Got two things. There we go, on fragment interaction. And I need to make this a public method. So I need to go, did I forget to copy the word public? Oh, it's a public interface, so I have to make it public. So public, there we go. Now I'm not doing anything in this method for the moment, but I just have to define the method. Eventually we'll add code to do something when the fragment interaction occurs. And I think that's really all we need to have it do. And if I hit run, it's restarting my app. Restarting my app. And I do have my simple application with the 3 items in it. Now, eventually, what you have to do is you have to do stuff to pass data back and forth. I have defined here this method, new instance, which I never used. So if I wanted to use the new instance to actually set arguments, because eventually your fragment will have to include arguments, you would actually, instead of creating your blank fragment this way, you would do bf equals, it's a static method, so I would do blank fragment dot new instance, which is the name of my method, new instance, and I pass in a string. So my fragment. So this is just an identifier for my fragment. I have to declare this as a blank fragment. So it says blank fragment BF, but instead of calling the constructor, it's going to call this new instant method, pass a string in, and this will go in to this method. This will call the new blank fragment method, but it will set some arguments up to allow you to pass data from the activity when you create the fragment to the fragment. If I run again, it should run exactly the same way as it did the first time. But we're creating now methods to pass data to the fragment and back from the fragment, which will allow you to code the app so every piece of the app can talk to each other. So if we look at my screenshot, it's loaded and I've got the items in my fragment. So that's all I'm going to talk about on setting up a fragment today.